Welcome to the Massachusetts Historical Society and to our public program, the second in a series this season on tech and innovation. I'm Catherine Allgor. I'm the president here of the Society. And tonight, I'm going to depart from my usual sort of chit chat to focus on something really important that's happening for us. And especially, I welcome you all from all over the world, but especially my Massachusetts people. We are at the Historical Society, the state sponsors of National History Day. And this is a nationwide project. It happens in every single state, and we're so lucky to be the home for Massachusetts students. Now, National History Day is perfect in so many ways, except the name, because it's not a day, it's an almost year-long process that teaches students through historical documents and through lessons of civics skills that will allow them to get into college, stay in college and graduate and be on the road to being well-informed, politically aware, media literate citizens of the United States. So we're thrilled with it. Now, here's the deal. In Massachusetts, we don't support it. We have to just raise private funds for this wonderful project. But we're trying to change that. And if you know anybody, write your representatives, your legislators, for your support for this fine program. We actually have an advocacy page. So if you go to our website, masthist.org, just type in History Day or follow the links, we'll get you to where you can actually advocate for us. So please consider that. And listen, for everybody in any state, support History Day. It's wonderful. All right, my plug is done, and I'm going to turn it over to Gavin, who's going to get us started. Gavin?
And thanks to everyone for joining us this evening. My name is Gavin Kleespies, and I'm the Director of Programs, Exhibitions, and Community Partnerships for the Massachusetts Historical Society. Tonight, we have a great program about one of our favorite topics, the innovation economy in Greater Boston. Did you know that Metro Boston is one of the most innovative places on Earth? From the first telephone call to the first computers that could talk to each other, to robots that help clean your house, there has been more innovation in and around Boston than almost anywhere else on Earth. While there might be something in the water, it's more likely that the sheer concentration of innovative companies and people has created an environment where innovation thrives, basically an innovation ecosystem. Tonight, we'll hear from Scott Kirsner, who has the great job of traveling around this ecosystem, learning what's being created, and writing stories about the successes and the failures. Before we get to this presentation, I'd like to mention just briefly that MHS is itself an innovation. We are the first historical society founded in America. We date back all the way to 1791, and we have been an independent nonprofit institution dedicated to collecting, preserving, publishing, and sharing our state and our nation's history for the past 230 years. We host 2 to 3 original events a week, including seminars that are geared at an academic audience, and programs like this one that is meant for anyone who is curious or has a love of American history. If you enjoy the talk tonight, I hope you'll check out our calendar online and find out what else we have coming up. We are at this time presenting all of our programs and seminars to the public for free, but we're only able to do this thanks to the support of our members and donors. So if you enjoy our programming, I hope you will consider joining MHS or donating to support our work. Getting to this evening's program, Scott Kirsner writes the weekly Innovation Economy column and blog for the Boston Globe and Boston.com. He has also been a contributing writer for Wired Magazine, Fast Company, Variety, the New York Times, Business Week, and other publications. He is the founder and CEO of Innovation Leader, and he is the author of several books on innovation and technology, including the book he'll be discussing today, Innovation Economy, True Stories of Startups, Flameouts, and Inventing the Future in New England. Mr. Kirsner will begin the program by taking us on a brief tour of innovative sites. And then a little later on in the program, he will be joined by iRobot co-founder Helen Greiner, and they will discuss the dynamics that make New England such a fertile place for invention and entrepreneurship. So without further ado, Scott.
Great. All right. Well, thank you for that introduction, Gavin. Before everybody joined us, I was telling Gavin that he's going to be my in-house fact checker because Gavin has written a lot of great stuff that you can find about the history of Cambridge and some of the manufacturing and innovation and science that has emanated from the city of Cambridge. So Gavin, I'll keep an eye on the chat for any factual corrections. My plan is this. First of all, I would love it if you would tell me in the chat where everybody is logged in from, because I'm curious with this audience, do we have all Massachusetts people? Are there some people from other parts of the world? So if you can use the Zoom chat interface to let us know where you're at, if you see that option. But my plan for our time together is to take you on a little tour, as Gavin just suggested, and we'll be touring 11 places that I think have been important to the history of innovation, not just in Boston, but in the world. We're going to go relatively quickly, but if there are questions throughout the tour, you can raise those in Q&A. I guess that's what we're using here. I see people from Florida, Weymouth, Massachusetts, Peabody, Massachusetts, Canton, where Paul Revere established his rolling copper mill, Boston. Chat has been disabled. So I guess we're using Q&A here on Zoom today. So use that to interact. I can see all of the questions that you post. So happy to take questions throughout. We're going to move pretty quickly. And the way I've structured this is geographically, not chronologically. So our tour is going to start right near City Hall Plaza, if you've been to City Hall Plaza in downtown Boston, just along Cambridge Street. And we're going to go all the way across the river into Harvard Square. And then we kind of have a last little dog leg into Somerville, just to give Somerville a little innovation credibility. And that's when Helen Greiner, the co-founder and former top executive at iRobot, she's started other robotics companies. She's going to join us to talk a little bit about innovation in Boston from the entrepreneur's perspective. And then we'll wrap up with any other questions that you may have. So other folks joining us from Carlisle, Pennsylvania, Forest Hill, Maryland, Bob Krim from Newton, who wrote another great book on inventions that we were talking about at another MHS event called Boston Made. Highly recommend it. And it's great that Bob is here because he and I have done this as an actual walking tour back in the days when we were allowed to go places together and hang out in rowdy groups. So I've got a map before each of these places just to give you a sense of where we are in the city. And so the first stop is 109 Court Street, which was a building that used to look like this in the 1860s and 1870s. And unfortunately, this building was demolished, I believe probably as part of the demolition of the West End to make room for what's now City Hall Plaza and the John F. Kennedy building. If you go to the John F. Kennedy Federal Building in downtown Boston, you can see a plaque commemorating where this building was. And use the question interface just as I talk here. If anyone recognizes the fellow on the right, tell me in the question interface. But you can see from the signage, this was basically the Radio Shack of its day. It was Charles Williams' telegraph instruments shop. And in the 1860s and 70s, obviously telegraph was the most important communication tool of the day. And Charles Williams rented space in those upstairs floors that you see to a bunch of different inventors. It was kind of the original incubator space or co-working space. Jim and Marianne and Anthony got this right. This is young Thomas Edison. We don't see a lot of pictures of him as a handsome young guy. We usually see the older white-haired pictures of Thomas Edison, but he started his career as an inventor here in Boston, working in this shared inventor space at 109 Court Street. One of the other inventors who worked in 109 Court Street who rented space was Alexander Graham Bell, who was a Boston University professor at the time that he invented the telephone in this building. So it's one of many buildings in Boston that I think we wished was still around. There is a recreation nearby that of Alexander Graham Bell's lab that Verizon now owns, which unfortunately is not open to the public, but I've managed to cajole them really just once to let us in on one of our innovation tours. So it'd be great to see that collection open a little bit more regularly. Stop number 2 is just down Cambridge Street at the Massachusetts General Hospital. And some of you use the question interface to let me know if you've ever been up into the top of the Bullfinch building at MGH. There's a space that's called the Ether Dome. And before I had been to the Ether Dome, it always made me think of the Thunderdome, and I kind of wondered what went on in the Ether Dome. The Ether Dome is this amazing space that was designed as a surgical theater and was designed to take advantage of natural light. You can see in my photo on the right just how much natural light is actually beaming in on a nice sunny day. That's our friend Bob Krim over there by the painting pointing to it. And at least one attendee, 2 attendees we have that have been into the Ether Dome. The really neat thing about this space is that if you are wandering around Mass General with nothing to do, you can go into this space. It's really set up as a gallery or museum. And as long as they're not giving a medical lecture, which is something they do on occasion, or teaching a class, you can go in and wander around. The picture that Bob's looking at is a picture of the first surgery. The date was 1846, the first surgery where the patient was knocked out using inhalable ether before surgery. It was partially knocked out. The reports at the time said that he was, sort of mostly anesthetized. He said it didn't hurt too much, but they realized that they sort of worked on better dosing of the ether after this first experiment. But I'm certainly always grateful when I have to go into a medical procedure to the dentist, Dr. Morton, who performed this first procedure. Let's see, Giorgetti says, I've been to rounds and lectures there, which is fantastic. So we're going to head over to the flat of Beacon Hill next, to 12 Lime Street. And you can see on my map, actually, there's a memorial in the public garden to the first use of ether. I sometimes refer to it as the only monument to drug usage anywhere in America. But I definitely encourage you to seek that out in the corner of the public garden there. But we're up here on Lime Street at this really beautiful residence. It's still a private residence on Beacon Hill. And the fellow who lived here was a guy named Georges Doriot, who was a French-born Harvard Business School professor. He served in both World War I and World War II. They called him General Doriot. I think he was a brigadier general in the army during World War II. And he started the first venture capital fund. It was called American Research and Development. And it really is regarded, he's regarded as the father of the venture capital industry. Before this, you really had to take out a bank loan if you wanted to start a company. You had to have wealthy friends or investors. Alexander Graham Bell found some wealthy investors to fund the invention of the telephone, but Doriot turned it into more of a business where you could get a meeting with him and potentially get funding from American Research and Development. Their most famous investment was in a company called Digital Equipment Corporation, which some of you may remember. It was once the second largest technology company in the world after IBM, making lots of mini computers for businesses. Doriot invested $70,000 in helping to start Digital Equipment Corporation, which turned into $38 million by the time Digital went public. So that's, if you're keeping score at home, it's a 500 times return on investment. So next we're going to go across the Longfellow Bridge, and stop number 4 is at the Volpe National Transportation Systems Center. And you may not know about this research and development arm of the Department of Transportation, but you've probably seen the building because it's one of the taller buildings in Kendall Square. There's a nice aerial view of it over there on the right, which gives you a sense of just how much acreage it takes up in Kendall Square, a lot of it parking lot and empty lawns. This building was initially built at a time when NASA was building something called the Electronics Research Center in Kendall Square. And as an aside, a lot of MIT researchers and the Draper Lab helped build a lot of the early guidance computers for NASA that got us to the moon and were used throughout the Apollo program. So NASA already had this great relationship with Cambridge to develop guidance computers. And they said, if we need a group of people to do continued research in all of the electronic systems that we're going to use for spacecraft, why not do it in Cambridge? Oh, wow. Eva Jane says, I worked at Volpe for 27 years, and Milton says, I had a summer job at the ERC. So some people have spent a lot of time in this building. So this gives you a sense of what NASA's plans were for this, not just one building, but a whole campus that would have been located in Cambridge. There's a bit of an urban legend that NASA's plan was to put mission control in Kendall Square. And that's kind of circulated around the internet, so much so that I heard it and felt like I needed to investigate. It turns out this was never supposed to be mission control. It was always about developing electronics and software for NASA. But they did, I think I've got a next slide here showing you just how much of Kendall Square they raised in advance of building this campus. So this really laid the groundwork for the Kendall Square that we know today. Laid the groundwork by bulldozing much of the old manufacturing buildings that had been in Kendall Square. And the interesting thing about this Electronics Research Center, and the reason that it's now a Department of Transportation building today, is that it opened in about 1964, I believe, and it was closed in 1970 as part of some budget cuts at NASA when Nixon was president. So it remains the only NASA site that has ever been shut down, which is an interesting distinction. And it's also kind of this alternate reality or alternate pathway that Kendall Square could have taken, where you could imagine thousands of NASA employees and government contractors being the denizens of Kendall Square, rather than the scientists and technologists and entrepreneurs that work in Kendall Square today. So moving on, this is probably my single favorite historic building in the innovation ecosystem in Boston. It's at 700 Main Street in Cambridge. And you can see what surrounds it thanks to Google Maps here. You've got a startup called CRISPR Therapeutics working on genetic editing. You've got Johnson & Johnson's startup initiative called J-Labs, which is based right at Lab Central. And you've got Moderna and Epizyme and all these biotech companies surrounding it. But this building, going back to the days of, going a little too fast here, going back to the days of Thomas Watson and Alexander Graham Bell over there, this building was initially, its site was the first manufacturer of railroad cars in the United States, a company called Kimball and Davenport that was one of the pioneers of the first center aisle design railroad cars. So then it becomes, then it's used as the site of the first long distance phone call. So Alexander Graham Bell was in Boston. He sent Watson over to this building, kind of between Kendall Square and Central Square, to be the other end of the long distance phone call. I believe they strung the wire right over the Longfellow Bridge. And that first long distance phone call was received in this building. Interestingly, so there's a plaque on the outside that commemorates that date in 1876. You can also see, if you look closely at the windows, the lintels in the windows of this building, that it's actually made of railroad tracks. So it's kind of a throwback or callback to the days when they were making railroad passenger cars on this site. And then the other really interesting historic connection is this was Edwin Land's private research lab when he was running Polaroid Corporation. And if you go today, it's now a startup space for biotech companies. And I don't think this was intentional, but you'll notice that Andy Warhol was one of the big users of Polaroid cameras. He always had his Polaroid with him and was snapping pictures. And this piece of art that's now in Lab Central is kind of an homage to the Warhol silk screens featuring Alexander Graham Bell's telephone. So I love that little detail. And now this building, still looking probably very much as it did in the 1800s, is home to dozens of biotech startup companies who all share the same laboratory equipment and space. So I want to get to some of the questions that I see popping up. NASA in Kendall and its connection to JFK and other folks who worked in this transportation system center. But let me get you through a few of these other sites. We're going to walk quickly on this tour. 200 Technology Square is really just across Main Street from where we were. And this is a more recent piece of history. It's a company that many of us didn't know existed 13, 14 months ago before the coronavirus pandemic. But Moderna is really a great example. It was founded only in September 2010, so this is very recent innovation history, but a great example of all of the funding that can go into these new biotech startups. Moderna was created by a venture capital firm called Flagship Pioneering that was interested in the potential of this messenger RNA technology. So really kind of custom designing these messenger RNA molecules to tell your body to do different things. Potentially, some of their ideas are around battling cancers. Some of their ideas are around other infectious diseases like Zika. And then the coronavirus pandemic comes along, and they've already got this experience designing these messenger RNA molecules, and they can custom craft one using this software that they built called the Drug Design Studio that can train your body to launch an immune response to the coronavirus. Let's see, we're going next to something that Gavin knows very well, having studied the history of candy manufacturing in Cambridge. So we're almost at Central Square now. And I'd always been curious about this building with a sign out front that looks like the Tootsie Roll logo. And this is the only signage out front of this, this factory. It says Cambridge Brands, Inc., a subsidiary of Tootsie Roll Industries. Sorry about this. My computer is very excited to keep moving on. This is the last operating candy factory in the city of Cambridge. In 1946, there were 66 different candy companies in Cambridge. A lot of people, if you can see in the background of this photo, is the former Necco factory, which is now occupied by Novartis's biggest pharmaceutical research lab, the Novartis Institute for Biological Research. They don't make candy there. They don't make candy there anymore. They're developing new kinds of drugs and therapeutics. But Cambridge Brands still makes every Junior Mint produced in the world. This woman in the center is Ellen Gordon, and she is the CEO of Tootsie Roll Industries. She spends part of her time in Wellesley, even though the company is based in Chicago. And I believe this is accurate, that she is, as of today, still the oldest CEO of a publicly traded company. But I'm gonna blank on her age. She is an octogenarian, and she is still very much in control of Tootsie Roll Industries and this plant that they have on Main Street. So the last few stops here over in Harvard Square, and then I'm excited to bring Helen Greiner into the conversation. Probably everybody on this Zoom meeting who has lived in the Boston area has been to out-of-town news in Harvard Square. It just is such a central, or has been such a central hangout for browsing magazines and newspapers, for meeting people. It's also the place where these two fellows, Paul Allen and Bill Gates, bought in 1975 this issue of Popular Electronics magazine, and learned about this new computer called the Altair 8800, and decided we're going to create an operating system and we're going to write some software for this computer, which led to the creation of the company Microsoft. Unfortunately, that company set up shop in Albuquerque, New Mexico initially, and then later in Seattle, where Bill Gates and Paul Allen were from. Although there is a pretty significant Microsoft site that is still in Kendall Square, and Microsoft does some forward-looking research at that site. So stop number 9 is the biological laboratories at Harvard on Divinity Ave. I'll show you the building over here on the right, with the rhinoceroses outside. And this is really a great, I wrote a column about this called How Cambridge Became the Life Sciences Capital, which you can find online. You can also find in my book. And it's just such an interesting story. In 1976, Harvard announced that it wanted to create a new laboratory to work with recombinant DNA. Al Vellucci, who's in the bottom left, was the mayor of Cambridge at the time, and he was really upset to read about Harvard's plans in the newspaper. Harvard didn't consult him, didn't meet with him first. And so this kind of started a battle between Vellucci and the city of Cambridge, and both Harvard and MIT, who wanted to work with recombinant DNA in the city. And there were hearings at Cambridge City Hall. Vellucci basically wanted to pass a year-long or 2-year-long moratorium to prevent Harvard and MIT from starting this research. But what they did instead was they created a working group to understand what were the risks, what were the implications of custom crafting DNA in these labs as drugs. There was a lot of fear that Vellucci tried to stir up, that DNA would and viruses would potentially escape from these labs. There was talk of Frankenstein monsters. There was talk of mutant rats getting out of the labs. The fellow up top is Wally Gilbert, who's now a Nobel laureate. At the time in the 70s, he was a professor at Harvard who wanted to do some of this work. And so Cambridge, basically by having this debate and this discussion about the risks of recombinant DNA science and how you could do it safely in the city, became the first city to really create the infrastructure to say, here's how we're going to do it. Here's how we're going to keep it safe. Here are the requirements for running a lab and working with recombinant DNA. And so this let not only Harvard and MIT do experiments that in kind of early biotechnology, but it led to Wally Gilbert and Philip Sharp and others creating the company Biogen. It led to other early biotech companies in Cambridge. And having this infrastructure basically is the reason that biotech today is in Cambridge largely, and not Boston and not Somerville. So really interesting example of public debate over science. I'll do, this is my last stop, and then we're going to segue into a conversation with Helen. On Soldiers Field Road, I don't think there's a street address, but this is on the campus of Harvard Business School. This map makes it look like you are right in the middle of Soldiers Field Road, but it's actually more on the Harvard campus. You have a business school student, Dan Bricklin, who's the fellow on the beard with the beard in the photo, working with paper spreadsheets and trying to do calculations on paper spreadsheets. Dan is very interested in some of the early personal computers that are starting to come on the market. And he says, well, why couldn't we use software and use these personal computers to do automatic spreadsheet calculations rather than doing them cell by cell on paper, where you had to, if you changed one cell or one piece of data on the spreadsheet, you then had to recalculate everything else. So Dan and his co-founder, Bob Frankston, in the picture, created software called VisiCalc to run on one of the early Apple computers. This motherboard behind me is actually an Apple II, so roughly the same late 70s, early 80s era computer. And at some point, Steve Jobs, while he's still at Apple, references VisiCalc as the piece of software that was really the killer app that helped Apple become a successful company and sell lots of its early computers into small businesses who wanted to be able to keep track of their spending using the VisiCalc spreadsheet. This is what the classroom looks like. There's a plaque on this back wall here commemorating this classroom in Aldrich Hall as the place where Dan Bricklin had the idea for the spreadsheet software. Once again, that's Bob Krim in the center of the room, and you can see Dan. He usually wears a plaid shirt, and so that's Dan in his plaid shirt in the front row of the classroom. So stop number 11 is a place in Somerville that doesn't really have any plaques, as far as I know, Helen. But I first visited this this strip mall right on the edge between the edge of the McGrath Highway, on the edge of Somerville, where it kind of merges into Cambridge. I think Gore Street right here is in the city of Cambridge. This Twin City Plaza Mall is technically in Somerville. And the second floor of this mall has some, what I would generously call ratty office space, which is so important to startups, right? Startups want inexpensive office space. They want to have room to experiment. They don't want to have to worry about staining the carpet, or bringing in heavy equipment that might damage things. So I'm really thrilled that we have Helen Greiner, one of the co-founders of iRobot, joining us. And I'm gonna, I think, skip the what's in this building now slide and go instead to my iRobot slide. And maybe have Helen talk a little bit about, first of all, do you agree that this was kind of ratty office space? And
well, it was when we were there. It was when we were there. We didn't fix it up, but I heard Formlabs fixed it up. So
it's gotten very nice. So situate us, because we're talking a lot about chronology. 1990 was when you started iRobot. Was this the first office space at the Twin City Mall, or did you have other office space before then?
The first, I would say, was probably Colin's apartment. The second was actually on Broadway, where we could sneak over to the MIT AI lab at night and pilfer borrow their supplies, and of course return them.
Well, so, okay, there's a lot to cover with you, Helen, but that's thing number one, which is a lot of people think that academia in Boston is just about giving people degrees and then vaulting them out into the world. But at MIT in particular, that thing you just mentioned is really characteristic, which is as you're starting a company, you're often still in labs at MIT using their equiment.
Right. We were using machine shops at night. I have to admit, we were taking supplies. I think we've made up for it through donations since then. But everybody knew that. And, sometimes it's not that we couldn't buy the supplies, it's that the lead time to get them. There's nothing like, hey, we got it in Mon's office.
Now, tell us we also talked a little bit about NASA earlier in this session. I know you had some contracts from NASA very early on, but were those the first things that iRobot worked on, or what were some of the first projects that really got the company rolling?
The two of them. One was a project from NASA to build a pretty complex robot. And then there was another separate contract from NASA to build a reasonably simple tracked robot. And I did ask some of the NASA engineers decades later, you already had some pretty good robots. What were you, why were you doing this? And they told me we wanted an industrial base to exist in robotics. And I thought that was pretty darn good policy, because now an industrial base in robotics does exist.
And so, I always feel like it's important to follow the money, right? The money story with different companies. When you started iRobot in 1990, I don't think that there were a lot of venture capital firms that wanted to put millions of dollars in robots just yet. So where did the money come from? Was it mostly government agencies?
I have to say, we didn't even try to raise venture capital for the first 8 years. We would have been turned down if we tried, but we didn't even try. Any robot for money was our philosophy. So we worked with a lot of Fortune 500 companies. We had those initial contracts from NASA, and then we started getting some more government contracts from places like DARPA in around 95, 97 timeframe.
So DARPA is the sort of advanced research project agency inside the Pentagon.
Some of the same people that funded Moderna.
Yeah, it's very interesting. But you could also say a huge part of Boston's robotics cluster really exists because of DARPA and Pentagon funding, right? I think Boston Dynamics, which is another company people are now familiar with, they were just on 60 Minutes a few weeks ago. Their YouTube videos have millions of views. I think that company, their first 10 years, right, was mostly DARPA funding.
Yeah, that's true. And what has it led to? Today, there was a video online of a robot dog peeing beer in a cup. And, how can you... That's true, by the way.
All right, I need to catch up on my YouTube.
You're
video.
not caught up on your robot video.
So tell us about, we can talk a little bit about who's using the space now, but you can see this is the post-renovation office space.
It was worse. It was
above the Twin City Mall. Helen, unfortunately, doesn't have pictures of iRobot's days, but why was this low rent space important to you? What did you guys like about it? What sorts of stuff were you doing in there?
We had no money, so the rent was great. And, being able to drive over to MIT very quickly was very, very helpful. Having interns be able to come over from MIT, Harvard, and other places was extremely helpful. And it's like you alluded to at the beginning, being able to, we put a tank for a robotic swimming fish right in the high bay, right? And most landlords would have a little bit of an issue with putting a full tank of water in the in the office.
I forgot. So were you at some point?
People at the Media Lab, one of the nicest buildings at MIT, the beautiful, beautiful building, and the people in it are complaining that they can't change anything. Like, we're supposed to be able to rapidly innovate, and we can't change the lighting, we can't change the infrastructure. So sometimes it is better to be in a place where you don't feel uncomfortable making changes.
I had actually forgotten about, so you were working on undersea robots at some point?
Many different kinds of robots, 18, but we don't have time probably in this meeting to talk about all of them.
You want to talk about the robotic baby doll that's on this slide?
Yeah, the robot baby doll. We had built a prototype of a motive robot and made the cover of National Geographic, and we were very excited about it, taking it a toy. So we went to talk to Hasbro, and they laughed because the amount that it would have cost would be thousands of dollars. But we went back to them with a cost-reduced version, which got us down to hundreds of dollars, and they laughed again. And when we started working with the engineers on really cost-reducing something, the baby doll got on the market for just $100, which is in the price point of high-end toys. And so it was a really learning experience for us, because we were all about building the latest and greatest thing with the coolest technology. And what we learned is that's not where the action is in robotics. The action is getting people equipment, that they could afford. In this case, a toy for entertainment, but and it wasn't a success, unfortunately. It was kind of hidden in the pink aisle and didn't really differentiate itself from other baby dolls. And some people, it kills me, but some people says it looks like Chucky, but
from the horror movies.
Horrible. Yeah.
Well,
I was want to say to a robot mom.
Well, I was talking to Colin recently, and he said that, he really credited this baby doll project, even though it wasn't a hit toy, with helping you guys, as you said, really understand how to make robots that consumers could afford, right? Which led to the launch of Roomba in I think 2002, right?
Right, being able to cost reduce the design, the learning there, the Far East manufacturing for that level. I mean, as things go up in value, manufacturing here is great, but for that kind of a level, being, offshore was really important. So we ended up, we chose to manufacture the first ones in a Hasbro, not own facility, but a facility they used because we knew they would check them out, right? We knew that we wouldn't have labor issues and stuff if we went with a family-friendly company, having checked it out. So there was so much learning from that experience, and the people we were able to hire for that project went on to really help with production versions of the Roomba.
Mm-hmm. Maybe two last things I'll ask you, and then we'll open it up to questions about what we've covered tonight, maybe about iRobot. Talk about the PackBot, which is this robot in the center of the slide. I saw a PackBot recently at the American Heritage Museum out in Hudson, and it was neat to stumble across it there.
No, also down the Smithsonian War Museum on the Mall in DC. And the Infantry Museum in Columbus, but it's one of the robots that I'm the most proud of helping create. We were working for DARPA and building these, research robots basically, and we came up with one that was a standout that climbed stairs and was very, very rugged. They were supposed to be in the labs for the next 10 years, but 9/11 happened, and that led to rapid equipping initiatives, and that led to getting them deployed. And over in Afghanistan, they were used to clear IEDs. So instead of sending a soldier up to a potential hazardous, potential explosion, they started sending the robots instead. And the military ran a study, and they credited the PackBot with saving the lives of hundreds of soldiers and thousands of civilians. So that makes me feel really good, right? That those people could come home because the robots were taking on the dangerous jobs.
Really amazing. Really amazing. So it's interesting. So Colin is still running iRobot. Mm-hmm. You have done 2 startups since then.
And worked as a general level position in the Pentagon.
That too, right? You've been busy. Rodney Brooks, who's the 3rd co-founder in the picture, has done a robotics startup, and I'm not exactly sure what he's doing now. He has moved out to San Francisco, I think.
It's AI system for robots.
AI systems for robots. I'll show. I think I have a picture. This is the turtle robot that Helen's working on now, which is a solar-powered garden weeding robot. Is that a fair description?
Yep, it's a weeding robot, and I love it. It was invented by the same person who, working for me and Colin, he invented the Roomba, and it actually prevents weeds in vegetable gardens. It goes around every day. It lives in the garden. It runs on sunshine, and it goes around, and it with its scrubbing wheels and a whacker, a spinning trimmer, it prevents weeds from ever taking root and growing. And it turns out that's a really, really effective. It's as effective as hand weeding. And I'm excited about it because its cost is $3.49, so it puts it in the realm of, hey, people can take out their wallets and just buy it and take it home. And it reimagines the job, which I've found over the years. That's really the way to have a successful robot product, instead of trying to duplicate how a human might recognize a weed and have a manipulator come out and, you know, dexterously pick it up and then have a disposal issue. We reimagine the problem so the robot prevents weeds from growing by doing the job robotically every day. And I think that's very powerful in robot concepts.
I mean, I think it's true that we in Massachusetts have, Massachusetts companies have produced, mostly thanks to iRobot, have produced more robots than anywhere else in the world, right? I mean, that's kind of why I thought it would be fun to bring you in as a case study here. I mean, would you have predicted that in 1990 when you were starting iRobot?
It would be unimaginable success when we started out, but you know, our goals have always increased as you know, as we had successes. If we had sold a few, you know, 1,000 robots at the beginning, we would have been very happy.
I love it.
Actually, you know, with iRobot, there's actually 30 million robots on the market, and 20% of the entire North American vacuum market. That's not the robot vacuum market, that's the entire vacuum market.
Really incredible. I mean, I would love to start seeing what kinds of questions folks want to ask. I have a hypothesis, Helen, that I want to run past you and Gavin in a minute, but someone says, I was told iRobot started in Beverly. That's not true. Can we fact check that, Helen?
No, we didn't start in Beverly. I live in Beverly now, though, and I love Beverly. No, definitely not. Well, I would say possibly Watertown, if you include Colin's apartment, but otherwise Cambridge with the place on Broadway.
Well, we have some other questions that have come in. There's one for Helen. Said, what was your early vision for the robots that you produced? Did you envision that they would be incorporated into everyday life for normal people?
I would love to say that, because I think we did have that as a, you know, what we wanted to do with our lives vision, but the early business plan was, you know, sometimes some crazy things like we want to be the first robot steps on the moon and have large companies pay for that. Now, I'm not saying it was wrong, but it might have been 20 years ahead of its time. It's coming back. But we were a little bit, I wouldn't recommend that as a business plan. But I actually felt very strongly about putting robots in the back of police cars to, you know, so you don't have to go into, policemen, officers don't have to go into dangerous situations. And that's reasonably close to what we ended up doing with the PackBot, to have a little robot buddy that goes out and takes on the dangerous situations for you.
Great. So Mark wrote a question, which I think is probably for Scott, that says, what about Mass Financial Services? I believe they invented the mutual fund. Is that on your tour?
Well, there's a lot of stops that I had to leave out on this tour because people can only walk so far. But yes, that's true. I mean, there's a lot of financial services innovation from both MFS and Fidelity Investments too. I think a lot of it is covered. I don't cover it in my book, Innovation Economy. I think a lot of it is covered in Bob Krim's book, Boston Made. I saw there's another question going back a bit about JFK, Kendall, and NASA. So the connection is, I believe that JFK was president, Ted Kennedy was running for president, and there was a lot of, was running for Senate, different era. And so there was a lot of sensitivity around how much of a gravy train Massachusetts could be on when this electronic research center was was being planned. And I think there's also a lot of belief that after JFK was assassinated and Nixon took over, there was a fair amount of anti-Massachusetts sentiment in the Nixon administration. And so some people will say that the reason this is the only NASA site that was ever closed was kind of, Nixon's punishment for, to a Democratic voting state. There isn't really a great book that's been written about this part of NASA history. I think there are some journal articles on it that you can find online, but definitely a lot of interesting political dimensions. But the space program, really, I think the speech at Rice University had already happened. It wasn't that this research center was in some way had a causal effect on the space program and its goals.
Although it was notable that Nixon won by a gigantic margin, except in Massachusetts. So there may have been a little bit of a personal feeling there, but so we had a question from Wyman, which maybe is a question for both of you. Said there's a restaurant in downtown Boston called Spice that uses robots to prepare food. It was started by some MIT graduates. Do you foresee the food restaurant industry becoming more like this, especially in our COVID-19 era, since it reduces human contact? I would also point out that I think Spice has a location in Harvard Square now as well. Helen or Scott, do you want to tackle that?
Well, I would love to go and check it out, but I haven't. And then with COVID, I mean, there's so many great applications for robots in there, and I think they picked a good one.
Yeah, I had been there a couple times pre-COVID to the Downtown Crossing location, and it was an interesting. I didn't quite get the benefit of having robots prepare your food because it didn't taste amazing. And there also still were plenty of humans that were helping you place your order at the kiosks and finishing the food, squirting a little bit of pesto sauce or a little sour cream. And so it wasn't like they had created a fully automated restaurant. And so I'm not really sure how it really changes the cost equation of running a quick service restaurant, to be honest. But they have raised a lot of money, and I always feel like my role as a journalist is, don't root against the entrepreneur.
And never root against robots.
Fair enough. So there's a question, which I'm sort of paraphrasing here, but essentially saying it's interesting to think about how much of the sort of innovation ecosystem is the product of chance. Sort of, NASA pulls out of Kendall Square, it leaves this big vacant space. Al Vellucci claims there's going to be Frankenstein rats in the sewers. Al Vellucci, by the way, fabulous guy. One of some of the best quotes ever.
Except for the Frankenstein rats.
Yeah. Well, he was also convinced that Harvard's Graduate School of Education had a building with a moat that they were going to fill with alligators. I mean, Al Vellucci was an amazing character. He was really a believer in political theater. But anyways, the Frankenstein rats does go on to sort of create this thriving hive of biotechnology. So is the innovation ecosystem now, is it self-sustaining, or does it need these sort of unpredictable things? The clearing of Kendall Square, the creation of the roadmap for biotechnology companies from Al Vellucci, who's opposing it. Has it left that point where it now is just so self-sustaining because of the amount of intellectual capital in this region, or does it still need some of those Al Velluccis?
I think it does need help in organizing. Coming in, robotics robotics have been around forever, but practical robots that are out there and companies getting funded really hadn't happened. So I was one of the organizers of, the first Massachusetts robot cluster, which is now morphed several times into mass robotics. And I think that's really helpful because they have helped so many of these, now there's hundreds of robot companies around, and being able to have a place where they can attract venture capital. They have a space for, for small startups that don't yet have funding to go and have the equipment, just like we use the MIT. Not everybody has access to MIT. So I really think it is important to organize as industries and, establish, what would you say? Hate to use this word, but dominance here.
Yeah, I do think it's pretty, you never want to rest on your laurels too much, but, having MIT for 150 plus years, having Harvard for almost 400 years, creeping up on 400 years. I mean, that's a pretty good advantage, just the magnetic pull that those institutions have to bring smart people and smart students, smart professors who really want to work at the leading edge. I did worry a little bit about, well, what is COVID going to do to the cluster? Would people disperse and say, hey, if I'm on Zoom all day, I could live in, Burlington, Vermont, or I could be in Provincetown. I don't need to be in Kendall Square. I was really encouraged today. I was interviewing an entrepreneur who said he had gone to one of his first in-person meetings in Kendall Square to get a pizza with one of his early employees. And they bumped into another employee of their company at the pizza shop. And I was like, oh, the cluster, the sort of what Bob Krim calls the bump and connect, those random meetings are starting to come back as people, come out of their COVID imposed isolation. And so I do think that randomness of people meeting and interacting and raising funding. I'll tell my favorite story and see if I can tell it in a minute, because it actually goes back to this one slide that I didn't really talk about that much. Let's see. Am I sharing here?
Nope.
No.
Oh, there you go.
All right. So this company, Formlabs, the founder is Max Lebowski, another MIT grad. He's at the Charles Hotel Courtyard having lunch, I believe, at Legal Seafoods. And he's pitching a venture capitalist who works for Best Buy to try to get this venture capitalist to invest in his company. And that venture capitalist doesn't invest, but it happens there's a guy sitting at the next table over named Mitch Kapoor, who used to be was the founder of Lotus Development Corporation, a huge software company in Cambridge. Mitch Kapoor is now an angel investor in tech companies. And he posts a tweet and he said, I'm here having lunch at Legal Seafoods in Harvard Square, and I can't believe I'm hearing yet another pitch for yet another 3D printing company. And Max Lebowski sees the tweet and he gets a message to Mitch and he says, look, I really think you should listen to why we're different. And Mitch Kapoor, sitting at the table next to him, winds up being the first investor in this company, Formlabs, which is now worth more than $1 billion, had $100 million plus in revenue last year, and is barely 10 years old. So I think that, that speaks pretty well for how the ecosystem works.
Yeah. And it's actually a really nice restaurant to sit on the patio. You can sit out there today. It's a great space. Yeah, Kendall Square definitely has been looking a lot less populated lately. I have to say that the new Akamai building just sort of breaks my heart, because they built this beautiful new building and it finished it right as the pandemic was happening. So it's been basically empty this entire time. But we have a question from Peter who says, there was a remark about at the beginning, iRobot did not look for venture capital funding for 8 years. Would that be different today? Is that better or worse?
I think it would be different today. When we were at MIT, we weren't really taught anything about entrepreneurship. I already spoken at classes there now, and I would have loved to have been in those classes when we started, before we started iRobot. So I think there's more of a sense of, then it was, well, you better have some experience. And now it's like, oh, we want the young people with the new ideas and, on top of this new way of doing things. So I think the whole mindset has shifted to be more focused on young entrepreneurs and beginning entrepreneurs.
Eileen says, Helen, you should talk about having worked at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory and also at the MIT Artificial Intelligence Laboratory. apparently this person may know you.
I'm sorry, what was the question?
It wasn't really much of a question, but it said that you should mention having worked at or talk about your experience working at NASA's Jet Propulsion.
I was an intern at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, which was a wonderful place to spend summers, and I did my master's out there as well. And at the AI lab, you know, I can't say enough great things. It's now CSAIL, Computer Science or Artificial Intelligence Lab. It's the crazy Dr. Seuss-like Geary building at MIT. And yeah, I met the two business partners at iRobot there, Rod Brooks and Colin Angle, and you know, dream come true. And for someone like me who's a robot geek.
I wonder, can I float my hypothesis past you, Helen, which is, you know, you've spent some time in California. I've lived in California a little bit. I feel like the culture in California can feel very wealth driven, right? It's like people, you know, you look at folks who worked at Apple or worked at Facebook, and they get so wealthy that in a way, the entrepreneurs that are coming up in the next generations are all like, oh, I need to get to that level of wealth and success and status. I feel like here in Boston, people are more driven by just discovery and wanting to work at the leading edge of their field. And they just care about, you know, like you were saying, sort of doing something first, solving really hard problems. And the commercial part is kind of not as important.
It's a means to an end, right? It creates that virtuous cycle of being able to invest more in advancements. But no, I think I think there's a lot more people that are driven by the discovery about the impact that you're going to have with your career here. And I'm glad, because that's, I mean, I think that's what it's all about. You're only here for a reasonably short amount of time. You want to do the most you can with it.
So I think we probably have time for one more question, just because we want to be conscious of people's time. So there was a question, are there other areas of New England that you think are becoming science technology centers besides Boston and Cambridge? Or is this sort of little cluster sucking all the technology out of the rest of the region?
You know, I always look at the greater Boston area, right? iRobot's in Bedford, Turtle is in Billerica, although we're all home, you know, with our robots tending our gardens here now. You know, I always look at it as the greater Boston area rather than any specific Somerville, Cambridge, Boston.
I always say, you know, Manchester is getting its act together to be a number 2 ecosystem. You know, they've got some larger companies there. They've got Dean Kamen and his Decker Research Lab working on all kinds of interesting government-funded research projects and some corporate-funded research projects. Startups, they have one of the biggest online universities in the country with Southern New Hampshire University, and they have a lot of inexpensive mill space. So I think Manchester is a not like a close number 2, but really has its act together in some nice ways.
Well, I don't think we get the word out like Miami or Austin is doing right now.
Right.
Yeah. And anyways, I want to be conscious of everyone's time. So I want to thank you for a great program and a great talk. And here's Catherine Allgor, our president.
Oh, Helen and Scott, thank you so much for that little field trip to the cutting edge. And here's to bump and connect, and hope we bump and connect at the Historical Society sometime soon.
Thank you for having me.
Pleasure.
Thanks, everyone. Great questions.
If people enjoyed the program, they'll consider buying a copy of Scott's book, which is called Innovation Economy, True Stories of Startups, Flameouts, and Inventing the Future in New England. So thank you both. Oh, there it is.
Thanks, everybody. Good night.
Good night.